Hello and good morning, everyone. So thank you for joining our digital data transformation webinar today. Today I'm joined by Greg Hallam, Services Solution Specialist, and Paul Baker, a Senior ITSM Consultant here at Bytes. So before I pass you over to our first speaker, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping details with you. The webinar will be recorded, so keep an eye on your inbox in the coming days and you'll be able to rewatch it on demand. You will be muted throughout the webinar, but if you do have any questions, please submit them in the chat throughout. These will be answered at the end of the webinar in the Q&A session, and there'll be a short feedback form at the end of the webinar. So if you can, please fill this in. We always appreciate your feedback. So I'm now going to pass you over to Greg Hallam.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. We have an agenda to go through today: the value of shared data, CMDB as part of the shared digital data platform, the principles of building a CMDB and what that really means in real life, looking at software asset management as a use case for how shared digital data can play a role. We'll look at some real world examples where we've delivered these services to customers and the lessons we've learned from that. Run through a summary, and then, as mentioned, we have a Q&A session at the end. And finally, there is a glossary of abbreviations and acronyms at the end of this deck, so I'll try and leave that on the screen at the end of the webinar. So if I do use those without explaining on the way through, apologies in advance. To introduce myself, Greg Hallam, Services Solution Specialist. So I am the Solution Specialist for Software Asset Management and related services within Bytes. And Paul Baker joins us as one of our Senior ITSM Delivery Consultants with extensive real-world customer experience in delivering ITSM solutions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the value of shared data. CMDB has become something of a buzzword of late. And while lots of organizations are really keen to implement something along those lines, it's important that everybody understands why they're doing it. So there's a number of massive benefits of shared data. The first being that it gives you a single pane of glass for all of the different systems and platforms that you now have spread across your hybrid working environments, from on-premise to cloud, etc. It gives a single view of everything that's out there and allows a shared reporting platform so that everybody accesses the same set of data. Secondly, it fills the gaps. We've got some excellent solutions out there in the wild collecting data around certain configuration items, but we have even better solutions collecting slightly different data around the same configuration item. So it's a useful way of layering these different data sources so that for any individual's record, we have the best sets of information possible, everything in one place for that individual CI. Related to that is the fact that we can prioritize where we have the most reliable, accurate, and up-to-date data, so that we're not stuck with a single source. We're not stuck with one piece of data because it provides something. We can bring all of those together and pick and choose. It also breaks down silos, not just digital silos, but organizational silos as well. If everybody is working from the same set of data, everybody is contributing to the same set of data, then it really does promote shared ownership as part of that data transformation and digital transformation overall. And in relation to that, it really does drive that collaborative teamwork. You know, the quote on there is that the sum is greater than the parts, and that's absolutely true with a good quality CMDB. The result is so much more useful to the business than all of the individual data sources that might exist otherwise. So we're going to look at what a CMDB is, and we're going to talk through its role as part of a digital platform. There's a couple of notes to make here. Firstly, we're going to largely talk about ITSM, because service management tends to be one of the main drivers for a CMDB. We're also going to talk about the CMDB in the context of a service management tool. You know, a spreadsheet could conceivably be a CMDB, but that's not what people think of, and that's not what organizations are generally looking to implement when we talk about these things. So we are going to make those two assumptions as we go through. So we'll start off by just talking about an individual asset, a server, which is a configuration item. A server is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. To the service desk, it's an asset that has to be supported. To finance, it's an asset that's being depreciated. To security, it's a point of vulnerability. So this server is a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and all of those things are true depending on this perspective. So it's really important that that asset and all of those attributes are available to everybody who has a vested interest in managing that asset. Take that up a layer, and if you consider the ITSM CMDB that's going to house that asset, Again, that CMDB is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. To service operations, it's a ticketing engine. To service transition, it's a way of managing the workflow of change. To service strategy, it's a way of aligning the SDM. But again, this is an ITSM centric view. So actually, for other parts of the organization, ITOM, ITAM, HR, DevOps, that CMDB is going to provide a different role around the same assets. So it's really important to have that perspective of this is not just one thing to one person. This has to be a lot of things to a lot of different people. Now that makes it quite a complex beast. So there has to be some benefits to going through the effort of implementing something like this. ServiceNow have collected some benefits from this, and yes, we have to recognize that ServiceNow have a vested interest, but this genuinely does reflect what we see in the real world with our customers. I won't go through all of the numbers on the screen, but they're clearly quite impressive. They lead to a more efficient service desk, better resolution of problems, a faster service for end users and parts of the business. They genuinely improve the performance of IT enormously. So if those are all of the benefits, how do we get there? The first thing is we have to start with why. Going back to that CI and that CMDB view, why do we want to collect that server data? Which one of those interested parties are we trying to service by providing the data? Which parts of the business are going to be accessing and using the CMDB? Is it just service management, or does it need to cover HR, security, and everybody else as well? It's really, really important to start with why. And because I want to implement a CMDB is really not a good reason for doing it. Really think about what business benefit you're trying to drive and how that's going to be realized. Once you understand why you're doing it and everybody else agrees, the first step is to define the process. What are the steps that we're going to go through to create this CMDB? And I'm going to talk about more of that in a second. You then need to think about the actual configuration item classes that you're going to have and determine the value of each one. Yes, there might be a load of stuff that you could put into a CMDB, but you should only put in the stuff that's relevant. Once you've identified those classes of CMDB, of CI, then it's time to start working out what the attributes are going to be and designing how that's going to fit together. A lot of CMDBs have a out-the-box design, which is absolutely acceptable, and some of them quite heavily rely on that to create a standard model for further expansion. But there's also a huge ability to customize these things. Although a word of warning is that customization does lead to a lot of additional cost and concern and challenges further down the road. Once you've designed how all of that data is going to sit together, then you can start to do the discovery and start to populate those assets and eventually start to map what belongs to which goes with which others, etc. At that point, it's simply a case of monitoring it and maintaining that CMDB. Sounds simple, right? However, as much as that best practice is useful, it's slightly different to what we see in the real world. What we tend to see in the real world is we have individual functions that exist within a business. So those are along the bottom of the screen. So for example, that could be software asset management, InfoSec, or data center management. And each of those functions today is likely to have its own tooling and its own managed data repository, its own database of information. And at the top, we have this concept of a ITSM CMDB that the business wants to implement. So the first step is in realizing that all of this fits together into a configuration management system. Now that might be a manual, a slightly poorly designed or defined CMS today, but it is still all part of the same piece. The other thing that you could start doing as a business is just referencing one data set against another, so that if function 1 has an asset that's also represented in function 2, we make sure that it is in both of those managed data repositories. We make sure that we're cross-referencing for data reliability between them. This generally is where we start to get involved with customers. This is quite often the situation where they start talking to us. The next step is to start feeding that CMDB with some of this data. So it could be that function 1 is manually populated into the CMDB. It could be that function 3 is being automatically populated and cross-referenced through API integration. So we start to build that CMDB, we start to have that data in there, having gone through that design process, having worked out which CI classes are important to us and what attributes we want to collect. The next step might be to get all of the data that's relevant into the CMDB. So now we've got all three functions fully integrated, providing data into the CMDB. Again, this is quite common because those functions already exist. That data is there today. Yes, you could potentially start by collecting that data within the CMDB service management tool if it's got the capability to do it. But for a lot of organizations, it's much, much faster to start populating from existing sources. But quite rightly, what you should be aiming to do at some point is actually to remove those individual managed data repositories. So if function 1 is something that can be delivered by the CMDB service management tool as well as by the individual function, then actually don't have it as a separate data source. Have the service management tool performing that function and populating directly into the CMDB. However, that might not be applicable for everything. For function 2, it could be that actually that's doing stuff and collecting data that you can't perform through the service management tool. It simply doesn't have the advanced functionality to replicate what is being done separately. So there's no benefit to trying to squeeze that into the service management tool's capabilities. Function 3, it could well be the case that actually this function is collecting a huge amount of information which is simply not within the scope of the CMDB today. So although we want to replicate some information across, actually 80% of it we really don't want clogging up the CMDB and creating extra noise. So we're going to leave that managed data repository outside of the CMDB today, and that's going to continue to exist in its own right until we bring that into the scope of the CMDB. Now, once you get to this point, you've effectively got a working CMDB, and obviously it's not that simple to get here. This is a hugely complex task. But the final step, and the reason we really should be thinking about implementing something like a CMDB, is so that we can start to achieve service mapping. We can start to understand how assets relate to each other, how they come together to form a service for the business, and how different functions within the business are providing different attributes for each individual CI that creates that service map. So again, coming back to our example of a server, we need to understand which service is running on that server. We need to understand the hardware, the software, the licensing, the vulnerabilities, the patch levels, etc. And those might all come from different places within the business, but they all need to be populated together so that if that server fails, or if that server is breached, or if that server is not properly licensed, we understand the implication of that to the service that is running and how that's going to affect end users or potentially even customer facing services. So that's kind of the experience that we've had with customers walking through that journey. If we specifically look at a particular example of software asset management, this is one that's particularly close to the heart of Bytes because software asset management is one of our absolute specialities. It's something that we've done for 20 odd years, and we have extensive mature services ability to deliver it. But what we're seeing is that more and more organizations want to integrate software asset management into service management. They want the SAM data in the CMDB, and there's huge benefit to that because software asset management and IT asset management, I'll kind of use those terms interchangeably through this. Those functions tend to collect absolutely data-rich inventory of the environment. They can populate huge amounts about those configuration items. Also, that data is essential for some of the workflows that service management is likely to deliver. So if we have the workflow across the top of the screen, and we've just taken a software request as the clear example here, that software request process is going to be heavily dependent on knowing about the software that's installed, the licenses that are assigned to it, whether it's being used, etc. So the asset management tool might be populating things like the software catalog. They might be providing the compliance information for part of that software request process. Option 1 is to have that SAM function delivered through the service management tool, i.e. it natively lives in the CMDB. Now, the benefit that that's going to have is that all data is stored in the CMDB. There is nothing sat outside that is not already collected. It means the SAM function is within the CMDB toolset, And clearly that provides a huge benefit in terms of integration. If you don't have to call out to another tool set, it means that actually the workflow is likely to work smoother than it would otherwise. It also means that all of the data is derived from and updated to the CMDB. So we're not challenging data. We've not got different records telling us different things. Everybody is working from the same information. The benefits, obviously, single source of shared data, so that if the service desk are supporting the server and need to understand the licensing of it, the SAM function has populated that data into the CMDB under the same CI record. So it's all in the same place. And that leads to data consistency. That means that actually everything is the same. And that really does promote data quality improvement, because if the SAM function spots that certain information is missing, then it drives the CMDB to be better populated by those service owners. That's one way of doing it. The other way to do it is to still, and sorry, just to go back one, the software asset management function still has to exist individually of the service desk and the service management, etc., because software asset management is a specialist function within the business. That manual interpretation of licensing data still has to happen, no matter how intelligent your SAM tooling is, whether that's within the service desk or not. There is always going to be manual intervention, manual management that requires a work desk to work from, that still has to be done separately. So although the data might live within the CMDB, there is still tasks that need to be done, either as part of the service management tool if it has that module, or outside of that. And that outside of it is the other option. So here, what we have is that entitlement, that installation, that usage information that's collected through the asset management tool populates into the SAM function with its own managed data repository. The SAM function looks at the entitlement, the installation and the usage. They calculate the compliance, and it's the compliance information that is then fed across into the CMDB to enable that software request workflow. So there's going to be a lot of data which is held within the SAM MDR that doesn't get populated into the CMDB because it's not needed. There's also going to be this function existing separately. So it's a separate tool set to where the CMDB is housed. It's going to be a SAM tool as opposed to being a module within the service management tool. Now, what this means is, as I say, the SAM data is held separately. Only relevant data is then provided across to the CMDB, and the function is outside of that tool set. What this allows for is very specific SAM functionality. So we tend to find that standalone niche software asset management tools still have an advantage over integrated SAM modules within a service management tool. They can do more advanced things. They have more advanced functionality in certain areas. So having it outside means you've got best of breed. It means there's no dependency on shared data. And actually, this is something that we've got real experience of, where the software asset management function needs to understand data about a certain CI. But that data in the CMDB is either missing or thought to be incorrect. Now, in the first scenario, option 1, where the SAM data all lives in the CMDB, to get that record corrected means that you have to work out who the data owner is for that element that you need, and you have to ask them to update the CMDB. Now, that sounds simple, but again, that record could be made up of multiple sources with multiple owners. So the SAM function really has no control over the data that they're working with, and they are highly dependent on other parts of the organization creating accurate and up-to-date records in the CMDB. And if the process isn't working smoothly, it means that SAM can't do their job. The other benefit of doing it this way is that you only share specific relevant data into the CMDB. Coming back to the point of don't put everything in there, only put in there what's needed. It means that actually all of the noise that's collected through a software asset management process doesn't end up populating into the CMDB and just creating additional records that lead to data decay if it's not being used properly. Now, which one of those options is best? It entirely depends on your scenario, on what your objectives are, on the maturity of your software asset management function, your service management function, where you are in that CMDB development cycle, and what it is you're trying to achieve from both service management and the CMDB and from software asset management. There is no right answer. There is no best way of doing it. They both have the pros and cons, and Bytes has experience of working with both models, with the relevant pros and cons becoming very, very clear as we go through that. So, as I say, we have worked with customers around CMDBs, and I'm going to hand over to Paul to talk us through some examples of what we've experienced and the lessons that we've learned through that process.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Just to confirm, my name's Paul Baker. I work for Bytes, and I'm an ITSM consultant, and I've got particular focus around the Digital Data Foundation, or the Digital Data Platform, or what we call the CMDB, in line with your digital data transformation journey or digital data modernization journey. I've worked with several customers, and generally when I start to work with customers, they are contacting us because there's a problem with the data. So that's when the problem generally manifests itself as a data problem, when the data is already being used, it's already live in your environment, which puts you in a bit of a troublesome spot, because by its very nature, the CMDB should be shared data. So there's lots of critics out there looking at the data and wanting to use it, but can't use it because of many different factors, like Greg has alluded to, in terms of poor data quality, missing data which just simply isn't accessible to the people who need to use it. So our journey with most customers starts with the data, because that's what's the problem is for them. And the reason it becomes a problem is because we forget. We ignore the why we need that data, what Greg alluded to. We forget, what do the outcomes we want to get from our CMDB, what are they? We generally want to share this data. We want to share this data with the organization. We want to promote a data sharing culture within the organization, and we want the organization to become data driven. So we have to enable that data driven capability to be able to create actionable insights, because at the end of the day, the actionable insights of that data is going to create the value you want from the CMDB or your digital data foundation. So we tend to ignore the why and go straight for the data. Now, the reason we ignore the why, because it's a complicated thing to do. We need to ask people, what do you want to the CMDB? People need to decide what they want. That's a difficult journey, but we're more comfortable with data, so we start to look at the data first. We become data focused instead of becoming outcome focused. So this is the problem we see with a lot of customers. They deliver a lot of data to their platform. They could even have a new platform or acquired a new technology, so they then turn it into a data migration project. And this is a big opportunity missed in your organization to actually start to streamline your data and actually look at what you need. Focus on the outcomes, focus on your users. What do they need to do their job? What do your outcomes need to be? Align your outcomes to business objectives and those sort of things. So invariably, once it's presented to your customers as a data problem, as you can see here, we have to go for a data architecture solution. We tend to go through data model and rationalization, consolidation and standardization. And you're already on the back foot, because there's going to be a lot of detractors out there who saying the data is not trustworthy, we can't use it, all sorts of things which are going to bring your digital data transformation and your digital data modernization to a standstill. So keep in your mind, and I speak to customers about this quite openly, in terms of when you're going on your data-driven journey for your digital data transformation, collect the right data, make sure it's accurate, make sure the data is accessible to the people who need it. All right. Just remember, data on its own does not solve problems. It does not add value. All right. In order to be data driven and for that data to add value, people must use it. People must apply that data. And the only way you know if they're applying that data is if people are going to use your CMDB. And the only way you know that people are going to use your CMDB is if you've asked them what they want, what's their outcome, what's going to make your life better today. So The main problem we see is the data. So how do you stop this from happening? A lot of customers have the data problem already because they've been data focused, not outcome focused. Greg, would you mind taking to the next slide? So that's all about the data. So collect the right data, put it in the right place, make sure people use it.
Yeah, and just before we move on, I think it's important to point out, we trying to give some customer examples, and actually we realized that, we kind of tongue in cheek have put customer example 1, 2, 3, and 4 on this, because this is a scenario that we commonly come across. This is not just a one-off. This is almost, the thing that we expect to find is the CMDB is designed for a specific purpose originally, and now an attempt to expand the scope of the CMDB is becoming a real problem, because exactly as Paul says, people have thought about the data rather than the whys and the potential future growth of it. So that's, it really is a common situation.
Yep, and they built up technical debt because they haven't seen into the future potentially to see what all the potential outcomes were. But it's not a quick fix anyway, and you can't possibly know all the outcomes you need, but you can have a good idea having speaking to your stakeholders as to understand what the CMDB is going to be used for and the outcomes they expect. So the customers generally come and say, well, how do we avoid this situation? And generally, it's creating a framework. Data governance, we've all heard of it. We all think we can do it. But what we like to do is try to apply an agile data governance by rolling out the CMDB initiative or your data transformation initiative iteratively, building on what you've done before to make it sustainable. Don't stand it all up in one day, spread it out over time. Agile data governance creates a sustainable, trusted and adopted data ecosystem where high quality assets are quick to discover, safe to use and easy to understand. It goes back to what we were saying before: collect the right data, put it in the right places, make sure people use it. Now, this is all leading to the fact that we need to ensure our data remains an asset, not a liability. We don't want our data in a shared context, and that's why we need to have it shared, because we want people to use it, but it's available for people to use and to see the problems. So we must ensure our data remains an asset and not a liability. So within the data governance framework, we go through a five-phase sort of program where we establish the data governance outcomes. Focus on your outcomes, focus on the users, align your objectives to organizational goals, build your roadmap, review and prioritize. What does success look like? Phase 2 is then dividing the data governance owners and stakeholders. Like Greg said, who owns what? Who are our owners? Who are the guardians, stewards, those sort of things? These are the people who are part of the data governance process. We establish our governing bodies. We've got on the slide there where Bytes are actively involved in managing CMDB steering committees. It's a governing body which helps organizations to plot the roadmap of their CMDB and make sure it's aligned to business objectives and the outcomes we've defined in phase 1. We define communities within that too. So we're going to have a community of data owners and stewards to ensure the data quality of our data remains consistent. And we need to move away from the fact that a lot of companies, you may have a CMDB team or a data integrity team, which looks after your digital data foundation or your digital data platform or CMDB. And people think that the CMDB team or the data integrity team own that data. We must move away from that. It's the data owners who own the data on the platform, and it's that accountability of that ownership which will drive the quality through the CMDB. After all, we all put our money in banks. Right? Just because I put our money in banks doesn't mean the banks own our money. We still own our money, but we rely on the bank to keep it safe, accessible for us. That's what a CMDB is trying to do. Keep your information, your data safe and accessible for you who own it and others who want to share it to deliver their outcomes. Phase 3, this is where people go straight to, and this is your assets, your data. So instead of starting at phase 1 and phase 2, we go straight for phase 3, which is the common problem. But this is where we actually start to define our data governance. What assets are we going to govern? How are we going to measure them? How are we going to monitor them? And it will also discuss the data quality standards, what good looks like from a asset perspective or CI perspective. And then we move on to phase 4, which is the design of the data governance process itself. We're going to define your core data management processes. We're going to define the performance management dashboards. Now, it's here primarily where your data integrity team or your CMDB team will manage the data on your behalf. So they will become the data guardians or the data, yes, the data guardians. So they don't own the data. The data owners own the data, but just like the bank, we're going to look after your data assets for you and make sure you can access them. So that's part of the collect the right data. Data must be accessible, but then it's the data owners and the data consumers who will then consume that data to deliver on the outcomes, which are defined in phase 1. And phase 5 is simply to enable the data governance technology in order to automate the data integrations and possibly automate the checks and balances, which will go into the performance management dashboards in phase 4, which basically says, how well are we doing? Are we doing well? Where do we need to improve? Are we hitting what we expected in phase 1 for the outcomes? Because all we can do is collect the right data and make it accessible. We rely on the data users to use it to promote data-driven philosophy and create actionable insights and value. I'll just leave you with one more thing, just to reiterate: ensure your data remains an asset and not a liability through a solid data governance framework, and focus on outcomes and users, and then focus on your data, which will deliver on those outcomes and users. I think that's me, Greg.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. And I think what was really interesting in this example is, we go in with customers expecting to really deal with the best practice of designing that data. Actually, what was really interesting was the engagement with the stakeholders, being that independent outside best practice body who could take a slightly more neutral view of the vested interests that people had in their data and in their CMDB. So yes, Bytes is excellent at driving best practice around data design and implementation, but we're also very, very good at providing that consultancy around actually helping organizations collaborate towards best practice and best outcomes. So to summarize what we've gone through, sharing of digital data is absolutely the way forwards. It's part of that digital transformation for most organizations, and it really does deliver some very tangible outcomes to the business. The CMDB is really the best way to do this. It is the heart of digital data sharing, but it is not a silver bullet. The CMDB will fail if it's not properly considered, if you don't go through those careful processes of designing it and thinking about potential scope. If you jump straight in, as Paul said, at just collecting data into one place, then you will end up with a mess. You'll lose confidence from the business, and it will start to undermine everything you've been trying to do. So if you are going to implement the CMDB, ask yourself why you're doing it. What are the business outcomes? What are the drivers? What are we looking to achieve as a result of this in our initial phases and later phases? And then take the time to properly go through those processes of designing and implementing. Where a CMDB can add value, 100% use it and make the most of it. But be careful that it doesn't become the answer to every question. If it's not going to add value, if the function is not mature enough to support it, provide it, or benefit from it, then don't use the CMDB just because it's there. Go back to that, starting with why. Think about that particular function and take time to design integration of that into an existing CMDB at the point where it will add value. I hope everybody's found that useful. I appreciate for some that's incredibly high level and really just a taster. I appreciate for others it's probably quite a lot of information to take in. Hopefully everybody has derived some benefit from that, and if you are interested in this topic, then please note that on the 30th of July, Bytes is having our Services Summit. This is an event that's coming back. It was always very popular historically. That event is coming back, and we absolutely will be talking about CMDBs and service management in more detail at that event. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye on the website, talk to your account manager at Bytes, and make sure you receive an invite for that event on the 30th of July. This is now an opportunity for anybody to ask questions, either in the chat or otherwise. And as we're going through the Q&A, what I'll do is I'll just leave this glossary on the screen so that anybody who's viewing the recording has an opportunity to pause the video and look at these in case they missed any.
Thank you.
Georgia, I was going to say, have we had any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I can't see any questions that have come through on the chat. So yeah, if anyone has got any, just put them through. But if not, thank you everyone for coming today. As Greg said, we do have a Supply and Optimization Summit in London on the 30th of June, which will be a really informative and fun day out. So keep an eye out for the invites, which will be coming your way soon. So if you'd like any more information, you can always contact us about anything at tellmemore@bytes.co.uk. Thank you to Greg and Paul, you've been great. If you'd like to rewatch the webinar at any point, you'll find it in your inbox in the next few days. I'm just going to put up a feedback poll as well, so please fill that out if you can. Do that now. Okay, so if no one has any questions, have a great rest of your day. Okay, looks like everyone that is still on has finished the feedback survey, so I'll end the call now. Thank you, Paul and Greg, again for today.
No problem.